Welcome to Perspectives from HSBC. Thanks for joining us. And now, on to today's show.
Welcome to the latest installment of HSBC's Perspective series. My name is Fred Neumann. I'm the Chief Asia Economist here at HSBC in Hong Kong. And I'm really delighted to be joined by one of the authors, really, when it comes to Asian global history, Peter Frankopan, of course, professor of global history at Oxford University. And I just had the pleasure to actually see your presentation here at the HSBC conference in Hong Kong. And I must say, really, the breadth and scope that you deliver is really it's really incomparable, I would say. Really, you bring in nuances, you bring in history, contemporary issues. So thank you. It's an honor to have you on this podcast.
Thanks, Fred. You know, this is one of the great cities on the planet. So being here and getting a chance to think about the lessons you can learn from history, the resonances, and like you said, you know, it's big history and big ideas are all very well, but they need to be detailed too. So getting that fine grain and the nuances is really important.
It does, yeah. The nuances, the details, the fine granularity. Of course, in the current environment, the big questions matter even more because we have so much uncertainty out there, geopolitically, trade policy, etc. But your first book was really called The Silk Road, the Silk Roads.
Right.
And maybe set us a scene of, because what you've done in this book is really put Central Asia, the Silk Roads, at the center of global history. Can you give us a sense of what does this involve? How far do these Silk Roads expand? When does this take place? Why are these so significant?
Okay. I guess it's about lots of different things. I mean, I'm interested, as I suspect everybody listening to this podcast and who's here at this conference, in histories of exchange. And of course, trade is part of that, but so too are things like religion, art, music, food, all the other things too. And so I'm interested in where people trade and exchange in the past. And when you start with that, you start with where are the first cities on Earth, and they tend to be the early ones that we really spend a lot of time thinking about, not just in Egypt, everyone hears about in their school classes, but in Mesopotamia, in what's now mainly Iraq and I guess a bit of Iran, in the Indus Valley, in the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. And those agglomerations of people start to build hierarchies, trade networks, corridors that link people together. So the Silk Roads as a label can mean whatever you want it to mean. I mean, if you're a tour guide or you're trying to sell a tourist package or you want to sell a map on Amazon, you draw some kind of line between China and the Mediterranean and you think that it looks like a motorway. But it's about high levels of interaction and exchange. In fact, the label was developed in the early 1800s by German geographers trying to understand how particularly China, Central Asia and India were connected. And the label of silk was because there's a lot of written material and a lot of surviving material actually about textiles that show that that was one of the major commodities that people were moving and trading. So when I wrote my book, I start the Silk Roads about just over 2,500 years ago, because you find high levels of interaction, not just across Central Asia, but locally within these different oases and cities and between them. But you start to find much higher levels of connection that link Europe, Africa, and Asia together. Now I'm a bit older and I know more. I'd probably go back to much earlier in history and those first genetic corridors that allow major global migration. So there's a reason why, for example, about 18% of the population in northern India share genetic material with Scandinavian people. And it's because Yamnaya populations that lived in what's now Central Eurasia, sort of Ukraine, Central Asia, moved, and as they migrated, they took ideas about art, about language, and also their genetics too. So these things, they go back thousands of years, but the Silk Road is quite a useful kind of catch-all to think about high levels of interaction and change together. So it depends on who you ask. If you ask someone in the Gulf what the Silk Roads are, they'll talk about 1001 Nights, they'll talk about Sinbad, they'll talk about trade with China, with India, with Central Asia. If you ask the last president of Turkmenistan, the Silk Road is a Turkmen idea that's connected with great Silk Roads of horsemen moving across the steppes. If you ask the Belt and Road Initiative and the governments in Beijing or in Xi'an, the Silk Roads was something that was deeply connected to China's past. But it's really about thinking about trade flows, networks, corridors, exchange. And it can be tempting to think about the shiny, expensive stuff. But the day-to-days, in today's world, where calories come from, food, energy, sort of basic building blocks of history are important too.
So it is really the center of human civilization in a way. There was cross-fertilization, ideas moving from east to west, west to east. There was genetic material moving east to west. There was goods, there was coins, there was silk. Of course, a lot of exchange.
North to south too. I mean, again, when people think
south.
about this, it always kind of goes east-west, but things go back in the other direction. So, I mean, there were more Christian. I mean, Christianity, I guess, is the quintessential, I think most people think of it as a European export because the Pope is in Rome or the Archbishop of Canterbury, is in England. But Christianity, of course, was born in Asia. It's a fulfillment of Judaic prophecies, and there are more Christians living in Asia than there are in Europe until around 1400. So one of the things I try to do in the Silk Roads is to remind that world order that most people think of as being natural, of the West being economically the superpower, being the cultural heartland. It was Western European countries that colonized the Americas and Africa and Asia. That center of gravity is really recent, and it's if you go back 500 years, the great cities on Earth, populations, the great scientists, the great schools of learning, they weren't in Europe. The Harvards and the Oxfords and Cambridges of the time were in places like Bukhara or Samarkand or Xi'an and so on. And that shift means that what we're seeing in today's world feels like a reversion to old.
So you're saying the Western-centric world, from that perspective, was an aberration in many ways. If you look at the long span of history.
Maybe aberration may be slightly provocative. It's not an aberration. It was because the Americas were essentially cut off from global trade connections until 1492. And when Columbus and those who followed, and then quite soon afterwards, the connections between Mexico and South America and China in particular from 1520s onwards, Magellan sailing around the world, those that bringing the Americas into global trade networks meant that centre of gravity obviously shifted, because Western Europe wasn't anymore at the wrong end of trade routes, it was suddenly in the centre. And that meant that Spain, Portugal, eventually Britain, Netherlands and so on, France, were in a much better place to exploit resources, riches and so on. But today's world in Asia, as you know, as a chief economist here for Asia, there are more people living in Asia than all the other continents combined. And at a certain point, that means that their interactions, their use of fossil fuels, their energy needs, their climate change elements, the calorie consumption, the water, it means that you start with what's happening here. So for example, right now there's a lot of criticism for China for its energy footprints, but per capita, Chinese citizens on average use 50% of an American citizen. And those kind of discussions then about what's fair, what's right, and what's balanced are why geopolitics has become such an important part of investment architecture at the moment today.
Now, the way your book certainly brings out the interconnectedness of the ancient world, antiquity of the Middle Ages, how ideas and trade and goods, moved across the Eurasian, African continents. There is a sense, though, that perhaps in recent decades, really strictly speaking, the Silk Roads have kind of fallen dormant a little bit, at least a span between Central Asia, maybe parts of the Middle East. Really activity moved west to Europe, moved to East Asia.
I know what you're saying, but I don't agree with that at all.
You don't agree with
that?
No. Yes,
I mean, look at the last 30 years. The breakdown of Afghanistan has been the single biggest spend on US defense budget of the last 3 decades. Iraq, likewise. The fact that the revolution in Iran in 1979 has given a global superpower, whether you think Iran deserves to be in that category or not, it doesn't really matter, but has fought 3 Cold Wars simultaneously against effectively Saudi Arabia. There's a bit of shift in that too, with the United States and also with Israel, with round about 2% of the US defense budget. So Iran is a kind of, whether you think it's an axis of evil, it's a key part of China's energy security and its military and diplomatic posture too. The emergence of the BRICS. This is all about the centrality of those connections between Russia, China, and West Asia too. So superficially, I agree with you when you go, well, what's happened in Central Asia that's been really important. You need to scratch the surface. But when you do that, and you see the play for rare earth minerals, for example, in Afghanistan, particularly in the last couple of years since the Taliban got back into power, places like Kazakhstan, 50% of the world's chromium, it's the 30% of the world's uranium. Those things they really do matter. So it's right, when we think about the Silk Roads, we think it's something about the past and about camels and trade that's been supplanted by ships. But energy security, food, exchange, networks, political power, it's always right there. Throw in Pakistan, throw in India, which chooses not to sit within what it thinks of
it's always
Silk
right
Roads.
there, you say, but it's becoming more important again, isn't it? Isn't it in the last 10 years becoming even more central again to the rest of the world compared to, say, the 50s and 60s? Is that?
It would depend. Again, it depends what you want. I mean, the whole Soviet space program was run out of Kazakhstan. There's a reason why NATO expanded into Turkey, was to have aperture over what happened across Central Asia as well as in Iran. The relationship with the Soviet Union and China under Mao was absolutely critical, and that all played out around the borderlands, where attitudes of China to its western provinces and to Central Asia were very heavily shaped by how Mao read the relationship with Khrushchev, and also how it read what was happening in the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 60s. So, of course that's true, because when we think of the 50s and 60s, it's all about JFK. It's about the kind of the Monroe Doctrine, or it's about the Marshall Plan. It's about US becoming the global superpower. But the Soviet nuclear system worked as a result of uranium coming from Central Asia. The relationships between India and the Soviet Union were incredibly profound, to the point that until about 3 years ago, 70% of India's defense spend was spent on Russian weapons and materials. So those connections they're there, but we don't focus on them because we don't think they're important. That says that's not just Eurocentrism. That's about following where the noise is loudest. And one of the challenges is that not many people specialize in these parts of the world. So something depends whether you mean Central Asia, Turkmen Republic, Tajikistan, or whether you mean broadly Silk Roads, which I mean the Gulf, I mean Iran, I mean in Iraq, I mean Central Asia, I mean India, Pakistan, China. Add those all together, and first you're at 50% of the world's population. You're at about 70% of the world's hydrocarbons, and that has accelerated dramatically. So I would put a place like Abu Dhabi. So I'm a football fan, for example. The two best teams in the UK, or in England, I should say, specifically, because they have different leagues. But two best teams in the last 30 years have been Chelsea, which is my team, which was owned for a large chunk of that by Roman Abramovich, whose wealth came from Russian hydrocarbons and metals, all to do with where they were being exported to. And the current best team in the world is Manchester City, which is all Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth. That's from Abu Dhabi's particularly from its fossil fuels. But that way in which the world has been shaped by actors, even just in the kind of day-to-day football world, let alone investment, has been huge. We don't think about it.
One, takeaway from your first book on the Silk Roads is the importance of goods exchange that brings ideas and prosperity with it as well.
Right.
Just to bring into the modern age, we see a little bit of with retreat from globalization in some corners of the world. Are you, as a historian, how worried are you about this? Do you see really the potential here for kind of a retreat from globalization, or does a study of history suggest actually interconnectivity is just a human impulse and there are new connections being formed, particularly in that part of the world, even if other parts of the global world retreat?
Yeah, look, I think anybody who tells you that microprocessors, supercomputers, militarization of space, somehow you can learn something from the East India Company or from Alexander the Great or the Silk Roads of the past, needs to have a stiff drink, because these worlds are very different. Our technologies means that the way in which we can think about corridors and networks, our distance and space don't matter quite so much. They do matter. Actually, we know that global trade and local trade are very closely correlated to your proximity. So, for example, the knitting together of ASEAN over the last 20 years, but particularly the last decade, and what we're expecting in the next 5 years, it's extremely rapid acceleration of interactions, because countries in the same neighbourhood are strongly incentivized to work together, to share, to lower trade tariffs and cooperate. But those networks also allow other things to happen. They allow fragilities. Things that allow you to have faster trade offer vulnerabilities. So, we learned that because of COVID, that the fact we're all globally connected and every place on Earth is about 18 hours by flight connected means that a pathogen that establishes spreads incredibly quickly. And the Silk Roads were, in the past times, were fantastic examples for that, because the Black Death spread along these trade networks incredibly quickly because the Mongols built networks that allowed information, people, goods to move really fast. So deglobalization, you can only learn so much thinking about the past. I suppose the sort of top line is that what is it that encourages people to trade with each other? And then if we have deglobalization, what is it that the politicians are trying to solve as a problem? And, you can see, for example, the current US administration, one of the challenges has been about the shift in manufacturing out of the United States to other parts of the world where cost of labor has been much cheaper. In many cases, environmental standards have been much lower, and the benefits have flowed to consumers. Now, it doesn't take much to realize, whether you agree with Trump's policies or not, that reshoring, whether it's domestic businesses or incentivizing, employment back in the US, that's not a difficult thing to get your head around. I think what the challenge is how do you find a level playing field that is politically sellable domestically within the US, but also at international levels. And for what it's worth, if history tells me something, it's that the chances of reaching some kind of grand bargain are probably quite high, because the incentives for all sides are right. And because I've spent a lot of time in China the last 10, 15 years, I don't think that policy planners that I've spoken to, people involved in business, people right at the top, the government, I don't think there's a conceptual problem about what's involved. It's how do you find a deal that works? And that's like anything that HSBC does. I mean, that's why this bank was set up in Hong Kong and in Shanghai in the first place.
1865.
160 years.
No,
right?
160 years, indeed. Yeah.
I'm not wearing any HSBC pin, I'm afraid. But that was there to provide credit, to facilitate exchange. And if exchange is imbalanced, then either get solved through revolution or breakdown.
And I think even
that
that history suggests we've gone through wars, we've gone through periods of rising terrors in the 1930s, and we always come back ultimately to further integration, human exchange. I think there's something inherently human about it. But I wanted to ask you, this idea of Silk Roads, we can think of it as a physical geographical location, but you've also extended that to new areas of connectivity. You talk about not just geographically, but the Arctic, for example, becoming more important now, but also digital, for example, and other types of kind of connectivity nowadays. Can you talk a little bit about those, what you have in mind?
Well, I think if you take Silk Roads as not a sort of particular defined cluster of places, and it's you can have people who say, is this place, have you traveled along the whole Silk Roads, or is this place on it, or is it not on it? History is very political. So, for example, the government in India and historians in India like to see themselves out of the ideas of the Silk Roads because it clashes with Modi's vision of what India is and of what China is. And so India's version of how it thinks about itself is, it can be exclusionary because it has its own view. I mean, ironically, that's something that's being capitalized at the moment in China, where India's, the contribution that Buddhism makes in Indian culture, or South Asian, I should say, South Asian cultures, because India is on a journey towards higher levels of Hinduism and exclusion of minorities and even including of Muslims and so on, that China is positioning itself to say that India may have discovered, or South Asia might have discovered Buddhism, but China is the current champion. So history is always political. So Hillary Clinton, for example, gave a speech in 2011 in Chennai talking about how important it was to rebuild the new Silk Road, she called it. And she specifically left China and Iran out of that because, from a US perspective, connecting India to Central Asia had greater connectivities. So if the Silk Roads is, you take a step back and go, it's just about trade, it's about connections, about networks, about corridors, then there's some obvious areas that one might think of that lower the politicization of geography, that lower the politicization of current states and administrations, that might change their views about what they're willing to talk about. And so some of those new networks seem to me second nature, that are no longer about caravanserais, camels. It's about digital connectivities. It's about cabling for energy supplies. It's about space. It's about changing the environment around us. Changing to react to the environment around us that's on the move, and the ways in which the Arctic are being opened up and will open up for shipping and for mineral exploitation, for seabed exploration, mean that those all form part of the same structure of how one thinks about global exchange. So, when I read about Silk Roads, I think thinking about how Latin America and China were connected, how Manila was the first proper global city set up in the 1570s, I think one needs to be loose with these definitions because they allow you more chance to think creatively about what you can learn from them. And the two big things about networks and corridors are both the ways in which they can act to galvanize and accelerate exchange, but also where their vulnerabilities are. And, you know, as a historian, I'm much more worried about downside and risk than about the assumption that the sun will rise every morning and that people will solve problems. My worry is that some of those shocks are poorly understood and they're very badly priced by markets because they don't look recognizable. So, for example, you know, I was brought into 10 Downing Street in December 2019 to talk about the next 10 years. This was a time when China was rising in the levels of geopolitical risk that we thought we faced in Europe. Russia was sort of emerging as something that we need to think about more, but not critical. And I said the two things I was worried about were a global pandemic and the lack of global response. And the question I should have been asked, which I wasn't, I said to the guys who invited me in, I said I didn't understand why that hadn't been run through, was why was that a risk right then? And you know, there are lots of different reasons if you work on histories and work on vulnerabilities. You maybe ask slightly different questions to if you're a straight up investor. It's interesting that banks like HSBC have pushed up geopolitical risk and even thinking about history to become much more important than they were 10 or 15 years ago. And probably we should have been doing that a long time before. So you know, there's a reason why people like me get invited to things like this, because it's not just about what can you learn from what happened 300-400 years ago or 2,000 years ago, but it's because that sense of perspective can be quite helpful in a changing world. And whatever your political views are, whichever part of the world you're living in, those changes today of an age of revolutions of climatological, technological, geopolitical, economic, etc., energy, food, demographic, there are so many of those things going on that having as wide open a field to listen to as possible makes sense.
Peter, this is a wonderful note to end on, and listening to you also, just going back to this idea of deglobalization risk, etc. We've been through these turmoils so many times before. We're really looking at reconfiguration of globalization. It's at different forms. Things are evolving. So thank you for this perspectives. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us on this episode of HSBC Perspectives. And we hope you join us again on the next episode. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Perspectives. Make sure you're subscribed to HSBC Global Viewpoint to stay connected